Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Electric Climate. For those who are new here, I'm Sequoia, and today I wanted to talk about some of the really affordable ways that you can make a big difference in making your desk setup look cohesive and put together while not breaking budget, whatever that is for you. So first I'm going to talk about 5 different types of items that you can have in your setup that look really nice and that don't cost a lot of money. And then the second half of this video is going to be 5 different concepts that you can apply. So you can take these concepts and choose any kind of product or just overall how you approach your setup to make it look nice. So the first thing that I recommend that you get for your setup is lighting. And I know people have different opinions on RGB. Some people feel like it's too much, other people really like it. But I feel like you can kind of customize this to your taste, but I do think that lighting really adds to the ambiance of a setup, especially if you got your setup at night. Having kind of a cozy atmosphere or just more of a vibey ambiance, I think is nice rather than using the dreaded overhead light or even like a plain lamp. To me, adding different lighting elements that have RGB in them is a good way of kind of bringing cohesiveness and a certain aesthetic to your setup. So I have Govee lights mostly in my setup, but you can get any brand. I know when I first built my setup, I got a lot of the lights from I think the Walmart brand, and Philips makes a line of RGB lights. So underneath my desk, I have strip lights, and I have the same strip lights behind my pegboard and set into the shelf above my computer setup. And then I have special monitor bars behind my 2 monitors here, and then one more additional monitor bar here on the pegboard, and then my lantern. And until a couple days ago, I had a round lamp here from IKEA. It was the IKEA Fado lamp, and I had inside it a Govee light bulb. This is actually the light bulb that I had in there, but unfortunately that fell off my desk and broke this week. So I'm debating whether or not to replace it. So let me know if you have seen my setup before, or I'll include a picture of what it looked like with the lamp on the desk. Let me know what you think. I'm debating whether or not to just leave it clear like this or to get another of the same lamp or put something else here. My next recommendation is to purchase items for your setup over time from thrift stores, or make things yourself, or buy unique items from Etsy. So I'm going to give some examples from my setup of things that fall into that category, but obviously this is going to look different for you. Again, like I said, depending on what your aesthetic is and depending on what you find. Some of my favorite aspects of my setup fall into this category. So I have a couple of things that are thrifted, and in my previous setup, if you go back to my old apartment and my old setup vibe, which was very different from this, there was a bunch of thrifted items as well. So this is definitely something that I really think makes a huge difference, and not only is usually a pretty affordable way of adding to your setup, but makes it unique and are most of the time items that nobody else is going to have in their setup. For me, this planter here is one of my favorite things in my setup. I got that from Etsy, and I will link the shop that I bought it from down below. It's a seller who has a bunch of these little handmade concrete planters with graffiti style art on them. Another thing from my setup that falls into this category is something that I actually made myself, which is the painting that I have up there. And I by no means am an artist, but I do like to get crafty sometimes. So I got inspired by the motherboard of a PC when I was building my gaming PC earlier this year, and I wanted to paint something that kind of brought in the other tech elements of my setup but stayed in like the color scheme. So I painted that. Maybe I'll frame it. I don't know, who knows, maybe I'll paint over it at some point, but doing a painting yourself if you are so inclined, or having a painting from your friend in your setup, I think is a good way of kind of bringing personal style in, and that was free. Another craft project is this mirror here, and this is something that I saw on Pinterest, I think. It was kind of a giant mirror with this frosted paint on it, and so I wanted to recreate that, and I bought this little circle mirror and some paint from Michael's, and I painted that myself. So that was a pretty cheap project, and it's fun. Again, that's one of those things that nobody else has this exact item in their setup, and I think it kind of ties into some of the other silver chrome-ish mirror elements in my setup without costing a lot of money. I think the mirror was like $3 from IKEA. This pen holder here underneath my monitor is something that I thrifted, and I think it ties in really well with my setup. So I'd encourage you to visit your local Goodwill or other thrift store. If you have a good one in your area, you are lucky. Where I used to live, there was an amazing thrift store by us, and here, not so much. So I have been doing less thrifting than I would like to, or than I previously did. But if you have a good thrift store, I definitely recommend checking it out and seeing what you can get for your setup. My next recommendation definitely falls into the budget category because it's usually free or maybe costs just a couple of dollars, and that is changing up your desktop background. And most of the time I get mine from Unsplash. Lately, I can link below the background that I'm using right now and some of the previous ones that I have used in videos if you're curious. So a background is a great way to, again, bring some personal style into your setup while also making changes that don't cost any money. I think that knowing when to spend money is as important as knowing when not to spend money in terms of staying in budget. So some of the items in my setup did cost a little bit more money if you're looking at everything from just a as cheap as possible budget perspective. My PC case is a really good example of that. I spent more money on the case, which is the Fantex Evolve X2, because I really like the look of the case, and I thought that this is kind of a statement item in my setup, and it's part of the aesthetic of my setup. I was able to budget that into my overall build by using other cheaper parts where maybe it made less of a difference. Obviously, not trying to, compromise performance for aesthetics completely, but there are certain trade-offs that you can make. So in my PC, for example, I used pretty cheap fans that still do a great job cooling. They cost $5. So I was able to allocate a little bit more money to the PC case itself, because that's one of the things that you really notice about my build. My gaming mic is another statement item in my setup, and this was a little more expensive than some of the cheaper options. I actually did buy a cheaper gaming mic and ended up returning it just because the sound quality was really bad. So this was not only an item that has good quality, but it did cost a little more. It wasn't a break the bank, this is not a professional podcasting mic that I have or anything like that, but I think it cost around $100. So definitely not the cheapest item you can buy, but to me, it really fits in with the setup vibe. I think that this is something that kind of just polishes the look of my setup. It matches my theme, and I think it looks a little different. I haven't seen anybody else with this microphone, so it stands out to me and therefore is a statement item that I justified spending a little more money on. Statement items don't have to cost a lot of money though. So another thing that I consider to be a statement item in my setup is actually these wrist rests. And I get so many questions about these. This is probably the item that people ask about the most on TikTok about my setup, is these wrist rests. And this was like $10 or $15 for this set. So definitely both a budget item and a statement item. And why I consider it to be a statement item is just, again, it's kind of eye-catching. So it's not a plain wrist rest. It is part of the whole setup aesthetic. So it's one of the first things that my eye is drawn to when I'm looking at my setup. It's a unique item and it matches the overall vibe that I'm going for. So choosing items, even if it's on the cheaper side, that make kind of a statement in your setup, I think is a really great use of money. The last item that I'm going to talk about are kind of the supporting items in your desk setup. So that could be the desk itself or your desk mat, basically the opposite of your statement items. And my recommendation for these is to choose neutral colors, and that way you can change different aspects of your desk setup and you won't need to repurchase these items. So my desk mat is this cream color. I've been tempted to replace it a few times just because I wanted something new, but I was sticking to my budget and I didn't buy a new one because this still matches the aesthetic even if I change certain other elements. The supporting items could include your peripherals. It's just a good idea to keep these kind of plain so that whatever vibe you end up going with your desktop background or your lighting in your setup, you can kind of stay with those same items without needing to repurchase them because they are just plain and go with anything. So now getting into kind of the more conceptual recommendations. The first one that I have is possibly the most important thing, and you probably already know this, but creating a theme and sticking to it. I would recommend spending time on Pinterest or social media and seeing what design elements you really like before you start shopping. That way you don't buy things that end up not fitting with your setup. My recommendation beyond just looking around at pictures is to choose a couple colors or a theme that every single item in your setup falls in that category, and then there's a cohesiveness. I know I've said this a bunch of times already, but I really think that sticking to your theme, and it can be tempting to not stick to your theme, is an important way to maximize what you have and make it look expensive. My colors and theme of this setup that I have is green, white, black, and chrome/silver. And you'll see that I have different elements of those colors throughout my setup. I like to have kind of mostly white and some black as my backdrop, and then different pops of green and silver. I think that if you follow this principle, you'll find that you kind of even out your setup. So if you have some more budget items and you have some more statement items, as long as they are in the same kind of aesthetic realm, you're not going to notice as much the items that maybe are a little more cheaply made. Like my desk is a good example of that. This was a really cheap, like particle board desk, but I feel like because I have some nicer elements and just an overall theme going to my setup, it's less noticeable than if everything in my setup was just kind of a jumble and poorly made. This next recommendation is definitely not going to be for everybody. If you don't like crafting at all and you just want to get things that are pre-made, maybe skip to the next chapter in this video. But the next recommendation that I have is to remake things that you already have so that they match your setup. So an example from my setup is this shelf that I have here, and there's another matching one that I have on the other side of the room. But I actually spray painted these. I took it apart and spray painted the wood from brown to white and the metal wire from black to silver when I redid this setup. Again, if you go back to some of my older videos, you'll see that I have this shelf, and it was the way that I bought it was just black and brown. And when I redid my setup, I didn't want to get rid of the shelf, and I also didn't want to have something that didn't match. So I spent a couple of dollars on some paint and I redid it to match my setup. You could apply this to lots of different parts of your setup, from furniture items to, I've seen people paint pegboards before and it came out pretty well. So get crafty with the things that you already have in your setup if you're doing kind of a big aesthetic change. Unless you just moved and you're starting from scratch with home furnishings, this next one is probably something that you can use, which is to take things that you already have around your house somewhere else and use it in your setup. And I have this a couple different places in my setup. I have a stack of books as decoration over here, the dice that I have in this tray, and if you are a tabletop gamer, you know how expensive dice can be, so this is kind of a nice way of using your dice that you spent a lot of money on and using them as decor so that you are getting more for your money. The lantern up there that I have in my setup is another thing that I've actually had forever. I've had that for I think over 10 years. I got it when I lived in my first apartment ever as an adult, and I've just kept it ever since then. It's definitely kind of dingy, but I feel like you can't really tell, especially at night. The next thing I want to talk about is where to find good quality budget items. And not everything in your setup, I think, has to be extremely good quality. Like I said before, my desk is a cheaper item. It's not going to last me forever, but it was within my budget at the time and it's held up pretty well. So I don't think you need to feel pressured to find a really good quality item for the best price for every single thing in your setup, but try to kind of mix and match, have certain things that are a little better quality and certain things that are maybe that budget, cheaply made item. In combination, I think you'll end up with a nice looking setup. So some of the places that I like to get budget items are IKEA for furniture and decor. The shelves that I have here and the pegboard are both from IKEA, and as well as the mirror, actually. Like I said, I kind of did a bit of a DIY on that, but you can find a lot of good things from IKEA, kind of good basic stuff. You're not going to find your centerpieces and your statement items, but you can find really good neutral basics, and the quality is pretty good for the price. Etsy is another place that I like to shop for budget items that are kind of cool and unique, handmade often. Like I said, the planter that I have here is from Etsy. I found some really cool keycaps, the kind of like resin encased keycaps. So you can find a lot of really unique stuff on Etsy, and oftentimes you aren't going to end up spending a ton of money. The box stores are a good place to get your basic items. Usually they'll have sales running, so just choose whatever place is selling the item you want for the cheapest. Thrifting is always a really good option. Like I mentioned earlier, it kind of can be hit or miss. Like I said, here I don't have a good thrift store near me, but I have in the past. And if you have a good thrift store near you, you should definitely be checking it out. You have to just kind of go regularly to find nice stuff. The next tip I have is to limit the sprawl of your setup. And if you have a really big area and you want to spread out, that's great. However, if you are trying to stay in budget, the less that you have to buy to fill your space, the less money you're going to spend. So I would recommend limiting your setup area to just a few key places. So for me, that's the top of my desk, my pegboard, and my shelf, and that's it. So I have more over here off camera. I have some shelves that I store various office supply things on, but that's not part of my setup. It could be, and I would like it to be, but the budget doesn't allow it. So definitely try to contain your setup to an area that makes sense for the amount of things that you are able to buy. If you try to redecorate your whole office at once, you're going to end up spending a lot of money. So even if you do it incrementally over time, as you have more money to spend on home improvements, that's a better option than trying to redo everything at once. I hope that you found something useful in this video, or you just feel inspired to redo your setup a little bit without spending a lot of money. Personally, I love to change up my setup, so that's why staying on a budget is so important for me, because if I gave myself free rein, I would be redoing it all of the time. So I have to stay within my guardrails, and these tips and items definitely help me do that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.